Let me hit the record button. Sorry, I always forget the importance. All right. So, Craig, you've been with us a couple of times talking about things, and we thought as we're starting to move into a transition phase, we should start talking about what that's going to look like, and the challenges that come with the change. Did you have a chance to put some thoughts together on that?
Yeah, we can definitely talk a little bit about that, and again, answer questions about that, or really, again, anything that people may want to ask during this time, as we continue to navigate it, both individually and collectively. So.
Okay. Well, you want to share your screen? Do you have something?
Actually, I don't have any visuals,
Okay.
so I can send a couple things afterward if that would be helpful.
Okay. You want me to start with a couple questions, and we'll see what else people have?
No, that's all right. I mean, I'll start with just a high level framing of some things, and then we can kind of go from there. So hi everyone, good to see you. And so again, for some of those folks may have been with us before over these last handful of weeks, I really am going to spend just 10 minutes or so just talking a little bit about kind of change, some of the challenges with that, some of our emotional responses, and kind of ways to identify and both take care of ourselves kind of around that. And then really, hopefully, much of the rest of the time will be kind of Q&A, because I really want to, again, as I've said before at these, really honor and answer kind of the questions and the needs of the people who are here on this group. And if you guys have thoughts or questions or things to raise, I'm sure many others who are not here do as well. Again, what I want to talk about is this idea of change and transition. So for those of you, or if anybody is familiar with William Bridges and his work, there's this idea of there's change, which is situational, and then there's transition, which is psychological. And so I'm going to use the word change throughout our time today to mean kind of the psychological component as well, because it's just more common word, common verbiage. But just to start, just the idea of, we make changes all the time, and quite successfully we navigate them kind of psychologically and emotionally. So if we think about our lives, our work lives, our personal lives, you probably can identify many, many, many changes that happen. They just happen even cyclically every year with, if you have kids that kind of keep growing up or going to new schools, if you've moved, if you've gotten married or divorced, if you got a promotion or, change your performance goals, right? So there's all of these changes we're navigating all the time. And we do it, quite successfully, largely, not to say that some of those things aren't challenging, but I like to start there, just highlight that, because I think oftentimes when we get into these really big transformational changes, very significant uncertainty involved in some of these changes, we kind of forget that we actually have a reservoir and a lot of resilience kind of built up in how to manage change that we can draw from. So with that, necessarily the idea of transition, or the process that we as people must go through, right, to navigate, to adjust to something new, it necessarily involves loss and grief, right? Because the first stage of that psychological process, the first stage of transition and to navigate a situational change, is this idea that we have to let go of, or the status quo of what was, right? The situation that did exist no longer exists. So emotionally, we have to let go of that, or kind of grieve and go through some sort of grieving process if we weren't expecting to have that change, especially if that change is significantly transformative, if that change is particularly uncertain, where the status quo or the current state changed, but we still don't understand what that future state exactly looks like. And so those types of grieving process can get even more complicated than many of the changes that we've navigated all the time. So I'm going to talk about the grief process and just kind of what that feels like, or may look like for many of you. But I did want to necessarily, again, talk about the idea of loss and what is it we're afraid of losing. So you may even find a quote, and I've use this in other things I've written before, but people in general don't fear change, they fear loss. We fear the loss of things. And so when I talk to people and we talk about, well, what is it we're afraid of losing in this situation? Naturally, the first few answers are typically things like that are situational or very concrete. Like I'm afraid of losing my job. I'm afraid of losing income. I'm afraid of losing, what in this case, a person or health. But when we kind of go to that next level, when we talk about what is it we're afraid of losing, it really starts to get into this anxiety that we look at and some of the emotions that are related to it. We're afraid of losing control. We're afraid of losing comfort. We're afraid of losing community. And these are many things I've talked to people about in this situation. We're potentially afraid of losing a sense of self or our identity. So we may be afraid of losing competence, literally. So, a couple examples in this is sometimes, I could even use the idea of, as a therapist or as a mental health professional, I've had very limited time kind of doing telehealth or teletherapy in my career. It wasn't something that I kind of navigated toward or were trying to necessarily do. And so obviously that's all we're doing now as a group. And I can tell you that my level of competence, or at least my feeling of my level of competence to do counseling and consulting, it feels less. Now, I didn't forget how to be a counselor. I didn't, lose all of my training or all of my experience, but it's just navigating a new medium and navigating a new system. And I feel like the cues and the connection I make with people and all that is challenged in a new way. And therefore I feel like maybe I'm not quite as effective as I have been. So, that's a kind of an easy example of how you might literally feel like I'm not as competent as I once was as we go through significant changes. I know I was talking to Diane last week and we talked about this idea of just identity. And it's like, well, if I can't practice my research, if I can't practice my profession, then a sense of who I am is somehow lost, right? It can be disturbed. So these are the things that, the types of losses, that transitional psychological process that we really, are challenged to kind of get through when we face these significant changes. So naturally, if we are looking at a situation where we are afraid of losing a sense of who we are, a sense of how well we can do things, a sense of, connecting with our community, a natural response to that is resistance, right? Like we are going to resist that. If I came to you and said, hey, we're going to do this thing and here's all these things you're going to potentially lose or feel like you're losing, I would hope you would be resistant. Actually, it's a quite natural, kind of healthy response, right? So I think that's really something I want to highlight for kind of the sense of self, if you are leading or working with others, to just know that resistance is an inevitable kind of emotional response to major changes because it's perceived as threatening to, our own security, our own sense of self, right? All resistance is an indicator that there is disruption. It's not, being resistant or feeling or witnessing resistance doesn't mean there's something wrong with you or the people around you. It just is denoting the fact that there is significant disruption happening. So it really represents that desire to kind of hold on to the status quo, to maintain things kind of the way they are, or put them back to the way they were. And as we talked about losing, things we lose, control being a significant one. We as people are, we're control oriented. And so when our expectations are disrupted, our ability to feel like we have control, of our lives and how our kind of decisions are being made, obviously resistance is gonna be the result. So during times like now, times where there's significant ambiguity, we often perceive more danger and less opportunity. And so the more that we can manage the ambiguity or be comfortable in a state of ambiguity, the more successful we'll be at kind of navigating, this change or these transformative changes. The less comfortable we are with kind of hanging with the ambiguity or what is uncertain, the more challenging it can be on that psychological, emotional, personal level to kind of navigate this change. And again, I will acknowledge that this is not easy, right? This transition is hard, right? The psychological process of navigating change is hard. So as we think about that, I just want to come back to the idea of grief, right? And the fact that the grief process in and of itself can be challenging. And we've taken what many of you may know as a process of grief that was created years ago by Kubler-Ross, and these stages, and it really maps to what we call like our personal change journey, right? Which is the stages of grief often being noted as denial, then anger, a sense of bargaining, moving into depression, and then ultimately acceptance. And so this kind of staged model of grief is something that not just an actual loss of life, but when we look at losses that come with significant change, we often experience very similar or almost the same types of things, depending on how significant that may be. So, and I'm sure many of you can think about, or as we've gone through this current circumstance, we can look, globally, nationally, our workplace, our family, our community, right, at all levels, and see and probably be able to identify some of this, right? Like people being in denial about kind of it was happening or how severe things would be. People, maybe being in denial about whether schools would be open or work, or I'd ever have to work from home. And, so we can identify all kinds of examples. And then again, people being angry about what decisions were being made or weren't being made, or, what could have been done. Maybe feeling a sense of, again, bargaining, like, well, if we can do this, then if we clean and institute all of these cleaning policies, we'll all be able to continue to to function or go to work. And so trying to take steps to find ways to again hold on to or get back to a sense of control and a sense of a steady state. All of those types of things, right? All of the idea of this grief process, again, very healthy, very normal. It's not something that we want to say, oh, why is that happening, or why am I stuck there? Or excuse me, why am I experiencing this? And as best as we can, we're trying to go through and not kind of get stuck in all of these places. And I would say, at this point in the process, on a collective basis for all the people I have contact with and kind of work with organizationally, I'd say there is more kind of just depression and a bit of sadness in that process collectively, where I could go back 4 or 6 weeks ago, there may have been more, denial, right? 6 weeks ago collectively. There's also a series of losses that are happening within this big picture, right? So there's this one overarching, when are we going to be back, quote, back to normal, and what does that look like, and will we ever go back to a certain state? And then within that, there's all these small processes that are happening, right? A lot of people have obviously kind of reached a state of acceptance of remote work and what that feels like, and not having kids going to be back in school until the fall, if they'll even be back in the fall at a certain state. And so we've had a bunch of going through processes to get to acceptance in order to make decisions, and yet we also have this big collective and our relationship with this, which is what and when will we kind of be done grieving kind of this whole experience. And so it can be exhausting, and it can take a toll, and it won't be linear. You won't naturally just go, once I'm past one state, doesn't mean you're not going to go back to denial for a bunch of reasons. So So the goal is, again, not to say, I'm all done. As we know, just like grieving, it can be complicated, and things can feel like we're in a better place at a certain point in time, and then in a future state we could be back to feeling pretty vulnerable. So just acknowledging that we have to kind of find ways to go through it. One of the rules I've learned over the years, grief and this process, related to grief and change, is no different. Really, the only rule is that we have to kind of go through it in some way, right? And whatever that looks like can be very personal, very individual, very community-based, cultural-based, society-based, but we just can't stay in denial and not try to kind of acknowledge the challenges, what we're feeling, decisions we're making around that. As long as we're being honest with ourselves through stages about how we're doing, we can keep kind of moving through that process. And that will help us with the transition part, the process which is why Bridges defined it as a process. It's a process that we have to go to come to terms with kind of a new state. So I did want to kind of finish with, in my opening remarks, just this idea of, right, the importance, again, which I think I say whenever I talk, taking care of ourselves, being super kind to ourselves and to each other as we're figuring out what we can do and how we can kind of do this, knowing that there's a lot of unknowns, and trying to kind of focus on, at baseline, what are the very key things we can do to take care of our physical selves, our emotional selves, our close family, circles, because that will help buoy us to deal with some of this uncertainty and some of this ongoing challenge. So I think, you hear it all the time. I can't stress how important it is. I did want to talk about, though, something a little bit that I haven't mentioned in the past here, when we talk about loss and change, that it can be quite unmooring, where we're really casting about with all of this uncertainty, and feel like we're not tethered to what we're used to, right? And so this happens with loss of people in our lives, when we have grief sometimes, and it certainly happens in these types of situations where, wow, routines and rules and sense of security and all kinds of things have been disrupted, and there's a lot of potentially unknowns, and we really can have a harder time sometimes getting back to how to make decisions, right? And how to be in the world when there's so many things we don't know. And so, again, the one thing is that comes back to that sphere of control, or the sense of control. And again, we have a very few things that we can control, which is our thoughts, our actions, how we're kind of going about things. And we don't have control of so much that's going on around us. But I think the idea that I found very helpful for people who are feeling, a bit unmoored is, and trying to make these daily decisions, weekly decisions about what to do, what to focus on, where to go, is to really get back to what I call your deepest values, or your core values. So if you're feeling particularly challenged during this time, is to really sit down and try to identify, and keep it pretty tight, right? Maybe 3 to 5 at the most. What are the values that you hold near and dear as a person to who you are in the world? And really think about, this is my values. These are my values. Forget about what's going on, and just say, at the end of the day, this is kind of my moral compass and what grounds me and what's most important to how I navigate. And then by reconnecting yourself with that, you can start to look at, what actions am I engaged in? What behaviors am I doing that are in alignment with those values? And what am I doing that maybe is in disservice to those values? And that's a good way to just kind of recenter yourself and make decisions when everything can feel very, confusing and cumbersome. It's just to say, okay, and again, for an example that I could give is, when I go through this exercise, right, I get down to things like family, my authenticity, loyalty, become things that are kind of at a core. Not to say I couldn't list 10 or 15 other things that are important to me, but really getting down to that level of these things are most important. And now how am I behaving? What do I need to do that is kind of serving those values? And that will really, again, kind of help refocus and recenter us to keep going through that transitional process, that kind of emotional and psychological part of navigating grief and navigating change. So kind of with that, I will kind of pause here or stop here and see if there are comments or questions that people want me to address, things that I haven't talked about, or just questions from stuff that maybe I've touched on.
Okay, Craig, why don't I stop the recording? So we've got your opening remarks and we can read